You're listening, aren't you? Good. That's what I need. Someone to listen, someone to hear this story before it's too late. Before the past becomes the present. Before the echoes of crimes long buried rise up again. It started with a phone call. They always do, don't they? A late-night ring, piercing through the silence, slicing into my solitude like a blade. I almost didn't answer. The weight of old ghosts held me back. The memories of cases that had once defined me, then ruined me, but my hand moved on its own, lifting the receiver before my mind could protest. Detective Holloway? No one had called me that in years. I exhaled slowly, staring at the darkened window, my own reflection barely visible against the night outside. Not anymore, I muttered. We need you. The voice on the other end was steady, urgent. There's been a murder. Not my problem. Not anymore. I had left that life behind when the force had shoved me out, when the press had dragged my name through the dirt, when my own mistakes had cost me everything. But then the voice said something that made my breath catch in my throat. It's exactly like the Ridgway slaughter. The Ridgway case, a 20-year-old nightmare, one of my cases. One I never solved. My mind went cold, my pulse slow and heavy. That crime scene had been burned into my memory. The way the bodies had been arranged, the symbols on the walls, the message left behind. A case that haunted me, because despite all my efforts, the killer had vanished, leaving nothing but questions in his wake. You're mistaken, I said, gripping the phone tighter. That case was never made public. The details weren't released. A pause. Then you better see it for yourself. The moment I stepped past the police tape, the past wrapped around me like a noose. The air was thick with the smell of copper and decay, the unmistakable scent of death. The apartment was eerily silent, save for the occasional shuffle of forensics, moving carefully, whispering among themselves. I took in the details like I always had, muscle memory taking over. The victim was a woman, mid-30s, dark hair fanned out against the blood-soaked carpet. Her hands were placed neatly on her chest, her fingers curled slightly, as if she had been gripping something before death took her. Her eyes were open, vacant, her lips parted in a frozen gasp. It was exactly the same. The room's walls bore the same symbols I had seen decades ago, scrawled in the same erratic, deliberate strokes. And there on the mirror, written in crimson, was a message I hadn't read in 20 years. Do you remember me? A chill ran through me. This wasn't just a copycat. This was something worse. The lead investigator, a woman named Detective Ramirez, watched me closely. We pulled the files, she said, voice careful. There's no way anyone outside the original team would know these details. The arrangement, the symbols, even the phrasing of the note. This wasn't leaked. Which means, whoever did this knows me, I finished. She nodded. Better than anyone should. I forced myself to take a step closer to the body, to the message, to the scene that felt like a portal straight into my worst failures. Someone wanted me here. Someone had reached into my past and pulled out a case that had broken me, laying it out again like an open wound. But why now? And why this one? A flicker of something familiar gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't grasp it. Not yet. Who found her? I asked, trying to ground myself in the present. Neighbor reported screaming around midnight. Said it was brief. By the time they got the super to open the door, she was already dead. Ramirez hesitated. No forced entry. She let him in. Of course she did. The Ridgway slaughter hadn't been about breaking and entering. It had been about trust. A killer who charmed his way in. Someone his victims never saw coming until it was too late. But that killer was long gone, wasn't he? I swallowed hard, rubbing a hand over my jaw. Do we have an ID on her? Ramirez flipped through her notes. Sophia Marquez. Lived alone. No known connections to the original Ridgway case, at least not that we can see yet. That didn't sit right with me. This wasn't random. Whoever did this wanted me to see it. There had to be a link, something I wasn't seeing yet. I scanned the room again, eyes lingering on the mirror. Do you remember me? The words stared back at me, taunting. I did remember, but I had no idea who was asking. Back in my apartment, I sat, in the dark, staring at old case files I had sworn never to look at again. The Ridgway slaughter had been one of the cases that ended my career, a mystery that had never been solved. The bodies, the messages, the eerie precision. It had all led to nothing. The case had gone cold, buried under newer horrors, until now. I traced my fingers over the crime scene photos, my mind spiraling through memories best left untouched. The victims, the evidence, the theories we had chased to dead ends. And then, something caught my eye. A photo of the original crime scene. The mirror. The message written in blood. It wasn't just the words that matched, it was the handwriting. My stomach tightened. I had spent years staring at those messages, trying to decode them, searching for patterns. I knew every line, every stroke. And this wasn't an imitation. It was the same. The killer hadn't copied the Ridgway slaughter. He was the Ridgway slaughter. Or someone who knew it just as intimately as I did. My pulse pounded in my ears. The past wasn't just haunting me, it was here. It had been waiting. And whoever was behind this wasn't finished yet. Sleep didn't come that night. It hadn't in years, not in any real way, but after what I had seen, what I had realized, I didn't even bother trying. The walls of my apartment felt too close, the silence too heavy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her body, saw the message scrawled on the mirror in that familiar, taunting hand. Do you remember me? I poured myself another drink and sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp, flipping through the old Ridgway case files for the 100th time. The faces of the victims stared back at me, frozen in time, their last moments captured in black and white. 5 murders, all identical in method, all leading to the same dead-end conclusion. No suspect, no motive, no justice. Until now. I rubbed my temple, exhaustion curling around the edges of my mind. If this was really the same killer, he had been dormant for 2 decades. Why return now? And how the hell did he know the details that had never been released? A thought wormed its way into my mind, one I didn't want to entertain. Someone on the inside. Someone who had access to the case files, to me. But there was no one left from the original team. Some had retired, others had moved on. Some were dead. And then there was him. My throat tightened, my hand clenching around the glass. No, it wasn't possible. It wasn't even worth considering. I forced myself to focus on the facts. The killer wanted me to see this. He wanted me involved. That meant he wasn't done yet. And if the past was any indication, there would be another body soon. The knock at my door came at exactly 4:12 a.m. I froze. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was slow, deliberate. 3 heavy thuds. Someone who wasn't in a hurry. Someone who knew I was awake. I didn't move at first, listening to the silence that followed. The apartment suddenly felt too still, as if the world outside had paused, waiting to see what I would do. Another knock. Same pattern. 3 solid hits against the wood. I set my glass down and reached for the gun I hadn't used in years, fingers curling around the familiar weight. My heartbeat was steady, but my breath was slow, controlled. I moved to the door, keeping to the shadows, glancing through the peephole. No one was there. I waited, listening. The hallway beyond was empty, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I hesitated, then unlatched the door and opened it just enough to see outside. A single envelope lay on the floor. I didn't pick it up right away. Instead, I scanned the hall looking for movement, for the feeling of being watched, but there was nothing. Whoever had left it was gone. Slowly, I crouched and lifted the envelope. No address, no markings, just my name, handwritten in careful, almost familiar strokes. I took it inside and placed it on the desk, staring at it like it might open itself. The paper was thick, expensive. This wasn't some half-thought threat scrawled on a napkin. This was planned. I exhaled and slid it open. A single photograph slid onto the desk. For a moment, My mind refused to understand what I was looking at. Then the breath left my lungs in a slow, hollow exhale. It was a picture of a body. Fresh. The victim was a man this time, mid-40s, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His hands were positioned the same way as the others, fingers curled slightly, the signature touch of the Ridgway slaughter. I turned the photo over. There was a message written on the back. "You missed one." The world around me felt distant, the edges of my vision tightening. Another murder, another recreation, and this time the killer hadn't waited for the police to find it. He had sent it to me directly. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady despite the cold grip of dread in my chest. Ramirez answered on the second ring. "There's been another one," I said. A pause. Then, "Where?" I looked at the photo again, at the background details, the faint glimpse of a street sign blurred at the edge of the frame. I knew that street. Ridgway Avenue, of course. The crime scene was a mirror image of the past, right down to the smell of stale blood and the way the air felt heavier inside the room. The victim, a businessman named Daniel Finch, had no known connection to Sofia Marquez, no link to the original Ridgway murders, and yet he had been killed the exact same way. I stood in the middle of the room, ignoring the forensics team as they worked, ignoring Ramirez as she asked questions. My eyes were on the wall, on the mirror. Another message. "You're getting closer." Ramirez moved to stand beside me, her arms crossed. "This is personal," she said. "Whoever this is, he's taunting you." I nodded. That much is obvious. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "The original Ridgway murders. What if this guy isn't just copying them? What if he's connected to the real killer somehow?" My stomach twisted. I had already thought of that, and I hated where the thought led. "You said no one else knew the details," Ramirez continued. "No one outside the department, no one alive anyway." I met her gaze. She was sharp, smarter than most, and she had just stepped onto the edge of a very dangerous truth. "Tell me something," she said, her voice careful now. "Back then, during the original case, who did you talk to about it? Outside of the department, I mean. Who knew you were working it?" I didn't answer right away. My mind was already moving backward, past the crime scenes, past the files, past the failures, to a time when my life hadn't been just blood and bodies and unanswered questions, to a time when I had a family. I swallowed hard. "No one," I lied. Ramirez watched me for a long moment. Then she nodded. But I knew she didn't believe me, and I knew deep down that the answer to all of this had been waiting for me all along, hidden in the past, or worse, right in front of me. I left the crime scene before the sun rose. The sky was turning a dull gray, the city still caught in that strange, hollow silence that comes just before morning. My head throbbed, my body heavy with exhaustion, but I couldn't go home. Not yet. Not with that message burned into my brain. "You're getting closer." To what? To him? To the past? I walked for a while, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, the streets empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery truck. My feet carried me without thinking, muscle memory leading me down familiar streets until I realized where I was. An old house. 3 stories, brick, weathered by time and neglect. The front steps sagged slightly, the shutters hanging loose. The paint had faded, peeling away in long, curling strips. I hadn't been here in years. It used to be my home. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the windows, half expecting a light to flicker on, half expecting to see a shadow move behind the curtains. But the house was dark, empty, nothing left inside but dust and memories I had tried to forget. This was where everything had started, and where everything had ended. I almost turned away, almost walked back into the city, back into the present where the past couldn't reach me. But something held me there, some invisible pull, the same force that had led me back to this case, back to this nightmare. I stepped forward. The front door was locked. Of course it was. I had locked it myself all those years ago when I left. But the key was still in my pocket, right where I had always kept it, as if a part of me had known I would come back someday. The lock clicked, the door groaned, and I stepped inside. The air smelled like old wood and forgotten time, like the ghosts of lives that had once filled these rooms. I moved carefully, my footsteps echoing too loudly against the floorboards. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed. No one had been here in a long time, except someone had. The picture frames in the hallway were wrong. They should have been covered in dust like everything else, but someone had touched them, moved them. One frame in particular was tilted slightly. The glass cracked at the corner. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the wooden edge, and then I saw the photo inside. A younger version of myself. My wife. And between us, a boy with his mother's dark eyes and my sharp features. A boy who had once been my world. My fingers tightened around the frame. My son. I hadn't spoken his name in years. Hadn't let myself. Because he was gone. Dead. But the frame had been moved. Someone had touched it. Someone had wanted me to see it. A noise broke the silence. Soft. Barely there. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding. It had come from upstairs. I moved without thinking. Instincts taking over, my body tense, my muscles coiled. The stairs groaned beneath my weight. Every step pulling me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, but the door at the end was slightly open. His old room. I reached for the handle, pushing the door open, my breath slow and controlled. The room was exactly as I had left it. The bed, the desk, the bookshelves lined with stories he used to love. But there was something new. A single sheet of paper placed neatly on the desk. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering as I read the words written in sharp, precise handwriting. I was never gone. The air seemed to freeze around me. My hands trembled as I picked up the paper, my mind rejecting what I was seeing, what it meant. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Because my son was dead, I had buried him. I had seen the coffin lowered into the ground, had felt the weight of the dirt in my hands as I let him go. I had lived with that pain, that guilt, every single day since. But the note was real. And so was the crime scene. I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply. If this was true, if my son was alive, then I had spent years mourning a ghost while he had been out there, watching, waiting. And now, he had come back. I wasn't sure. How long I stood there, the paper clutched in my hands, my mind unraveling. Then, from somewhere in the house, a door creaked. Someone else was here. I turned sharply, my body moving before my mind could catch up. My gun was in my hand, the weight familiar, steadying. I moved quickly, back down the hall, scanning the shadows, listening for movement. Nothing. I reached the stairs, pausing at the top. The front door was still open, the cold air from outside creeping in. But something felt wrong, like I was being watched. I stepped forward, every nerve on edge, every instinct screaming. And then, a whisper. Close. Right behind me. Dad. I spun around, gun raised, but there was nothing there. Only the empty house, the silence pressing in, the weight of the past suffocating. My son was dead, but his voice was still here, and I wasn't alone. The whisper still clung to the air, dissolving into the silence, but I felt it settle deep inside me like a splinter beneath the skin. My grip on the gun tightened. My eyes darted through the shadows, searching, my breath slow, steady. But the house was still. Empty. I wasn't alone. I knew that. Someone had been here. Someone had left the note. Someone had whispered my name just inches away from my ear. But there was nothing. No movement. No footsteps. Just the steady, oppressive quiet of a house long abandoned. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to control the slow panic creeping into my veins. My son was dead. That was the truth I had lived with for years. I had seen his body, I had put him in the ground, and yet, the note in my hand was real. The photograph sent to me was real. The Ridgeway murders were real. Someone was playing a game with me, dragging me back through time, forcing me to relive every failure, every mistake. But why? I turned, moving carefully down the stairs, my body still rigid, alert. I kept the gun raised, sweeping every corner of the house as I made my way toward the door. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unseen, something wrong. Then I noticed it. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. A trail of faint footprints leading from the front door toward the back of the house, small, deliberate steps, like someone had been standing just behind me watching. I swallowed hard and followed them. The footprints led through the dim hallway, past the old kitchen toward the back door. It was closed, latched, just as I had left it. I reached for the knob, my fingers curling around the cold metal. I hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. I inhaled slowly, turned the latch, and pushed the door open. The night air hit me first, cold and sharp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. The backyard was empty, overgrown with weeds, the wooden fence leaning with age. But in the center of the yard, beneath the weak glow of a distant street lamp, something was waiting. A single chair, and on it another envelope. I moved forward slowly, every step feeling too loud in the quiet night. The chair was old, rusted at the joints, one leg slightly uneven. The envelope rested on the seat, placed with careful precision. I picked it up, turned it over. No name this time, no markings, just like the last one. I opened it. Inside was another photograph. A boy, dark hair, sharp features, eyes that belonged to his mother. My son. My breath caught in my throat. The image was recent. It wasn't an old photo, not something pulled from the past. The boy in the picture was older now, a man, and at the bottom of the photograph, written in the same careful, precise handwriting as the notes before, "You buried the wrong body." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the photo, my fingers tightening until the edges curled. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, my breath coming in slow, shallow bursts. No, this wasn't possible. This was some kind of sick trick. I had buried my son. I had mourned him. But the face staring back at me from the photograph told a different story. I forced myself to move, to turn away from the chair, from the message, from the past that refused to stay buried. I shoved the envelope into my coat, my fingers still shaking, and then I saw it. A figure. Standing at the far edge of the yard, just beyond the fence, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me. I froze, my body coiled, my pulse hammering. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, silent, waiting. I took a step forward. The figure turned, and then, without a sound, disappeared into the darkness. I didn't follow. I couldn't, because deep down, in the part of me that had never stopped grieving, I already knew the truth. He was alive, and he had come back. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where the figure had been. The night pressed in around me, thick with the weight of something unseen, something waiting just beyond reach. The photograph in my hand felt heavier now, like it carried more than just an image. It carried the truth, or at least the promise of one. I had buried the wrong body. The words replayed in my head, looping over and over like a broken record. I wanted to reject them, to tell myself it was impossible, that there was no way I could have made a mistake like that. But the evidence was staring back at me. The recent photo, the messages, the precision of the crime scenes, the way the killer knew things no one else should. My son. I forced my body to move, my legs stiff as I turned away from the yard and stepped back into the house. The walls felt tighter now, the air stagnant, pressing against me as I walked back toward the front door. My mind was already racing ahead, putting the pieces together. following a path I wasn't sure I wanted to see the end of. There was only one way to know the truth. I had to dig him up. The cemetery was silent, empty, the way it always was in the dead of night. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the brittle leaves, whispering against the rows of headstones. I moved quickly, staying low, my flashlight off, relying on the faint glow of the moon to guide me. I didn't belong here, not like this. But then again, neither did my son. I found the grave easily. I had been here so many times before, standing over the headstone, speaking to the dirt as if it could hear me, telling him I was sorry, telling him I had failed. I didn't say anything this time. I just started digging. The shovel cut into the earth with a dull, muffled thud, the soil damp from recent rain. I worked quickly, methodically, my body moving on instinct even as my mind recoiled from what I was doing. The deeper I went, the harder it became to breathe. Every muscle in my body ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Then, after what felt like hours, the sound changed. The shovel hit something solid. Wood. I dropped to my knees, my hands clawing at the dirt, pushing it away until the coffin was fully uncovered. My fingers trembled as I found the edges of the lid, hesitating for only a second before I wedged the shovel beneath it and pried it open. The hinges groaned. The scent of earth and decay rose up to meet me, and then I saw what was inside. Not my son. Someone else. The body was skeletal now, unrecognizable, but it was clear. The size, the structure, it wasn't him. It had never been him. I had been mourning, a stranger for years. My breath shuddered out of me, my vision blurring. He had been alive this whole time, but where had he been? And more importantly, why had he stayed away? I barely had time to process the horror of it before I felt it. A presence behind me. I turned too late. A sharp, brutal pain exploded at the base of my skull. My vision splintered, the world tilting sideways as I fell against the dirt, my hands, clawing at nothing. The cold seeped into me, my limbs suddenly too heavy, my thoughts scattering like dead leaves in the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and then a voice. Soft, familiar. "You shouldn't have done that, Dad." I tried to move, tried to focus, but the darkness was pressing in now, pulling me under. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the face of the son I had thought I had buried. Older now, harder, and smiling. When I woke, I was in a chair. My wrists and ankles were bound, the rope digging into my skin. My head throbbed, my vision swimming as I blinked against the harsh fluorescent light overhead. A basement. The walls were concrete, unfinished, cold. The air smelled damp, metallic. Something about it was too familiar. And then I saw him, standing, just a few feet away, watching me. My son, alive. I let out a slow breath, my throat dry, my pulse steady despite the storm raging inside me. "It's really you," I said, my voice hoarse. He tilted his head slightly, studying me the way a predator studies its prey. "It is." "You've been alive all this time," I said, more to myself than to him. The words felt foreign, unnatural. I had lived with his death for so long, shaped my life around it, let it carve me into something broken. But it had been a lie, a trick, a nightmare I had accepted as real. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "You never even questioned it, did you?" His voice was calm, almost curious. "You never asked yourself how a father, how a detective, could misidentify his own son's body?" I swallowed hard. Who was in that grave? His smile was slow, calculated. Someone who deserved it. The weight of those words settled over me, thick and suffocating. I had spent years searching for the Ridgeway killer, but I had been looking in the wrong places. He had been right in front of me the whole time. "You killed them," I said, the truth settling into my bones. "The recreations, the messages. You were leading me here." His eyes darkened slightly. "I wanted you to understand." "Understand what?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. That I did what you never could. I found the real Ridgeway killer. I stared at him, my breath slow and measured. And you killed him. His smile didn't waver. I made it right. The air between us felt sharp, crackling with something dangerous. You were just a kid, I said, my voice quieter now. How did you— It doesn't matter, he interrupted. What matters is that I fixed your mistake. I exhaled, my chest tightening. And the others, the new victims, what were they? His expression didn't change. Proof. That I failed? He tilted his head slightly. That I was always better at this than you. Silence stretched between us, heavy and final. Then he stepped back, reaching into his pocket. My body tensed instinctively, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a key and set it on the table between us. You're free to go, he said, if you want to. I stared at the key, my mind racing. You came back for me, I said slowly. His gaze met mine, steady, unblinking. I came back to show you the truth. A pause. Now it's your choice what you do with it. The key glinted under the fluorescent light, and I realized for the first time that no matter what I chose, I would never be free from this. I woke up to the smell of smoke, thick, suffocating, unnatural. My chest tightened before my brain could even register what was happening. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming, caught in some half-conscious haze. But then I heard it, my mother's scream. Michael, Ryan, fire, get out! My body reacted before my mind did. I kicked off my sheets, staggered toward the door, and flung it open. The hallway was barely visible. Black smoke poured in from the stairwell, curling up the walls like fingers reaching for me. My throat burned as I inhaled, my vision blurred with the sting of it. The fire had already spread. Down the hall, past Ryan's closed bedroom door, the staircase was completely engulfed in flames. The wooden steps were cracking, groaning under the weight of the heat. The orange glow flickered violently, licking the walls, creeping closer. I heard my father coughing from behind his bedroom door. My mother's frantic voice followed, muffled, but desperate. I took a step forward, but the heat slammed into me like a wave. It was too late, I couldn't reach them. Mom! I choked out. My voice barely made it over the crackling of burning wood. Something crashed downstairs. Maybe the dining table, maybe the cabinets. The fire was devouring everything. My head spun, and for the first time I felt real fear. Not the kind you get from horror movies or bad dreams, but the kind that settles deep in your gut and tells you this is it. You're not getting out of this. Then, out of nowhere, I heard Ryan's voice. Mike! His bedroom door flung open. He was coughing violently, his eyes wide with terror. His face was streaked with sweat, panic written all over him. I barely recognized him like that. We have to go, he yelled. I grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward my bedroom. My window, the only way out. We didn't have time to think. I shoved the window open, cold air rushing in to meet the heat. It felt wrong, unnatural, like the night itself was rejecting the fire's presence. The drop to the backyard wasn't impossible, but it wasn't safe either. Ryan hesitated. Jump, damn it. I pushed him forward. He hesitated for just a second, longer before climbing onto the ledge. And then he was gone, disappearing into the dark. I didn't wait. I swung myself over the edge, feeling the momentary weightlessness before I hit the ground. Pain shot up my legs, but it didn't matter. We were alive. I turned back toward the house. The flames had spread to the roof, the windows exploding one by one. I could still hear my mother's voice inside. Then it stopped. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because Ryan grabbed me, shaking me hard. We have to go. The neighbors will call 911. I barely heard him. We stumbled through the backyard, coughing, choking, tears mixing with the sweat on our faces. Sirens wailed in the distance. The fire trucks were coming, but it was too late. Everything was gone. By the time the firefighters arrived, There was nothing left of the house but a skeletal frame, glowing embers flickering in the night. The smell of burning wood, plastic, and something worse, something I didn't want to name, hung in the air. I stood there, shaking, staring at the remains of my home, the only place I had ever known. Ryan sat on the curb, hugging his knees. His face was unreadable, his hands trembling. A firefighter approached us, his face grim. "Are your parents inside?" I couldn't speak. My throat was raw. My chest felt like it was caving in. Ryan answered for me. Yes, that was the moment. I realized they were dead. That my mother's voice had gone silent forever. That my father's last words had been trapped behind the bedroom door, suffocated by the smoke. That was the moment everything changed. The fire trucks lined the street, their flashing lights cutting through the thick black smoke that still curled from the remains of our home. Neighbors stood outside in their pajamas, their faces pale in the glow of the emergency lights. Some whispered to each other, others just stared. I didn't care. I couldn't feel anything. I was wrapped in a stiff gray blanket that smelled like chemicals and sweat. But it didn't help the shaking. My fingers felt numb. My lungs burned from the smoke and my head was pounding like someone had cracked a brick against it. I could still hear my mother's screams, even though they had long since been swallowed by the fire. The paramedics checked, Ryan first. He had a cut on his forehead from the fall. His hands were covered in soot and he kept coughing so hard I thought he was going to throw up. They asked him questions, but he barely answered, just nodded or shook his head. Then it was my turn. "Michael, can you hear me?" a woman's voice said. I blinked up at her. She had kind brown eyes, but her expression was clinical, focused. She shined a small flashlight in my eyes, tilting my head from side to side. "Any dizziness? Chest pain?" I didn't answer. I just watched the firefighters, their silhouettes moving through the wreckage. "Michael," she said again, this time softer. "I need you to talk to me." "I'm fine," I croaked. My voice barely sounded like my own. She frowned but didn't push. Instead, she reached for an oxygen mask and gently pulled the elastic over my head. Cool air flooded my lungs, but it did nothing to clear the smoke from my mind. I turned my head slightly and saw them. The 2 body bags being carried out of what used to be my parents' bedroom. A sound came out of me before I even knew what it was. A choked, guttural noise. The paramedic put a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off. I didn't want comfort. I wanted this to be a nightmare I could wake up from. Ryan sat on the curb a few feet away, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. His face was blank, empty, but I knew him. I knew that look. It wasn't shock. It was something else. I forced myself to stand, my knees nearly buckling under me. The paramedic tried to stop me, but I ignored her. I walked straight to Ryan and dropped down in front of him. "What happened?" I asked, my voice low, raw. He didn't answer. "Ryan," I snapped. "What happened?" His eyes flicked up to mine, just for a second, before dropping back to the ground. "I don't know," he whispered. The way he said it made my stomach turn. Before I could say anything else, a new voice cut through the noise. "Michael? Ryan?" I turned to see Detective Mark Calloway approaching. He was tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his late 40s. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loose around his neck. He didn't look like he belonged at a crime scene. He looked like he belonged at a bar after a long shift. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp. "I know this is a lot," he said, crouching down in front of us. His voice was calm, steady. "But I need to ask you both some questions." Ryan didn't move. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay." The detective glanced at the remains of the house, then back at us. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Took a shaky breath. I woke up to my mom screaming about the fire. The hallway was already filled with smoke. I tried to get to them, but I couldn't. He nodded like he had heard this 1,000 times before. "And you?" he asked, looking. At Ryan, Ryan's fingers twitched against his knee. "Same." Detective Calloway studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I know this is hard, but the firefighters found gasoline containers in the backyard. My breath caught. Gasoline? The detective's gaze flicked between us, watching. For a reaction. You boys know anything about that? I shook my head immediately. No. Ryan didn't answer. A slow, uneasy feeling started creeping up my spine. Ryan? The detective pushed. Ryan's jaw tightened. His shoulders hunched forward slightly like he was trying to make himself smaller. I don't know, he said again. Liar. I didn't say it out loud, but the word burned in my throat. Calloway sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, you're both coming with me to the station, standard procedure. Ryan finally looked up. Are we under arrest? No, Calloway said simply, but we need to clear some things up. I glanced at Ryan, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. The bad feeling in my gut twisted tighter. Something was wrong, and I was starting to think my brother knew exactly what it was. The police station was colder than I expected, not just in temperature, but in feeling. The walls were dull gray, the floors scuffed, the air thick with the faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Even though I wasn't handcuffed, I felt trapped the moment we stepped inside. A uniformed officer led me and Ryan down a long hallway, past desks cluttered with paperwork, ringing phones, and officers who barely glanced up as we passed. The whole place buzzed with an energy that made my skin itch, like the world kept moving, but we were stuck in slow motion. Detective Calloway directed me to one room and Ryan to another. I didn't like that. I want to stay with him, I said, my voice harsher than I meant it to be. Calloway didn't even hesitate. Not how this works, kid. Ryan kept his head down as another officer guided him away. He didn't look back. Cold feelings settled in my chest. The interrogation room was small, too small. A single table, 2 chairs, a buzzing fluorescent light above. A camera sat in the corner, its little red light blinking. The detective took his time, setting a folder, down in front of him, flipping it open. I could barely make out the black and white crime scene photos inside, but I knew what they were. The charred remains of my house and the bodies inside it. I clenched my jaw and looked away. Calloway sighed, rubbing his hands together before finally speaking. Michael, I need you to be honest with me. I swallowed hard. I have been. He nodded slowly, like he didn't believe me. Let's go through it again. You woke up to your mom screaming. What happened next? I exhaled shakily, staring at my hands. I got out of bed, opened my door, and saw the smoke. The fire was already on the stairs. I heard my parents in their room, but I couldn't get to them. You said Ryan's door was still shut? Yeah. When did he come out? I hesitated, remembering the moment. The way he had burst from his room, coughing, eyes wide with something I couldn't name. Right after I did, I said. Was he panicking? I blinked at the question. Of course he was. Calloway studied me. You're sure? Something about the way he asked made my stomach knot. Yes, I said firmly. He didn't look convinced. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, tapping a finger on the folder. Tell me about Ryan. What kind of kid is he? I frowned. Why does that matter? It matters. I shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. He's quiet. Kind of keeps to himself. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Discipline problems? No. His expression didn't change. Never got into trouble? I hesitated. I mean, normal teenage stuff. Drugs? I flinched. No. His eyes didn't move from mine. Michael, we already know Ryan was caught with marijuana before. I exhaled sharply, looking away. That was a long time ago. 3 months, he corrected. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. It wasn't a big deal. Your parents thought it was. I snapped my head back toward him. What? Calloway flipped through a few pages, then turned. One toward me. It was a police report. My father's name was listed as the complainant. He reported Ryan as a runaway after an argument about his drug use, Calloway said, watching my reaction closely. Sound familiar? My throat felt tight. I remembered that night how my dad had screamed at Ryan, how Ryan had stormed out and didn't come back until the next morning. But I hadn't known Dad actually called the cops. I forced my voice to stay even. So what? He was mad. He came home. Calloway nodded slowly, then flipped another page. Your father told the responding officers he was worried Ryan would do something drastic. I stared at him. What are you saying? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. You told me you woke up to your mom screaming, but the fire department determined the fire started in the basement. I frowned. What does that mean? It means it was burning for a while before you woke up. My skin went cold. Calloway. Let that sit for a moment before continuing. The fire marshal found traces of gasoline on the basement stairs, the living room, and outside your parents' bedroom. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Michael, he said carefully, are you absolutely sure Ryan was asleep before the fire started? My heart was pounding. Yes, but for the first time I wasn't sure if I was lying. Calloway studied me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the suffocating silence. I barely had time to process before the door opened again. But it wasn't Calloway this time, it was Ryan. His face was pale, his hands shaking. His eyes flicked to me, wide, almost afraid. I stood up immediately. What's wrong? He didn't answer right away. He just swallowed hard, looking over his shoulder at the door like he expected someone to drag him back inside. Finally, he whispered, Mike, they think I did it. I stared at him. Ryan, I didn't. He cut me off. His voice was shaking, desperate. I swear to God I didn't. I wanted to believe him, but I could see it. The fear, the guilt, the hesitation. And suddenly, I wasn't so sure anymore. I stared at Ryan, searching his face for something, anything, that would tell me what was really going on. His eyes were wide, his breathing uneven, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. He looked scared. But scared of what? The detectives? The situation? Or the truth? I didn't do it, he whispered again, voice cracking. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Then why do they think you did? Ryan glanced over his shoulder again, as if someone might be listening, then lowered his voice even further. They found stuff. What stuff? His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Gasoline. On my clothes. I felt the blood drain from my face. That wasn't just bad. That was damning. Ryan. My voice came out quieter than I intended. He shook his head quickly, stepping forward. I don't know how it got there, Mike, I swear. I didn't pour anything. I didn't light anything. I was sleeping. My mind was spinning. Sleeping. That was the part that didn't make sense. If the fire had started in the basement, if it had spread through the living room and up the stairs, that meant it had been burning for longer than we thought. And yet, Ryan had only come out of his room when I did. Not before. Not when the smoke first filled the hallway. Not when my mother screamed. Not when my father coughed behind their bedroom door. Why? Mike, Ryan said again, his voice pleading. You believe me, right? I opened my mouth. Hesitated. The answer should have been simple. Yes, of course. He was my brother. But my stomach twisted, and the words caught in my throat. The door opened before I could say anything. Detective Calloway stepped in, looking between us. Time's up, Ryan, let's go. Ryan flinched. He turned back to me, eyes wide, desperate. I forced myself to nod. I believe you, I said. I just wasn't sure if it was true. We weren't arrested. Not yet. Instead, we were taken home, to our uncle's house, because we didn't have a home anymore. The detectives let us go with a warning. Don't leave town. It didn't feel real. Nothing did. Uncle David didn't say much when he picked us up from the station. Just drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tight I thought he might snap it in half. He wasn't the affectionate type, never had been. But when we stepped into his apartment, he let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his face. "Go shower," he muttered. "You both smell like smoke." I didn't argue. In the bathroom, I stood under the scalding water for too long, trying to scrub the smell out of my skin. But no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't go away. The fire had buried itself into my pores, into my hair, into my lungs. I kept hearing my mother's voice. I kept seeing the flames. I kept thinking about the gasoline on Ryan's clothes. After I got out, I sat on the edge of the bed in the tiny guest room, staring at nothing. I could hear Ryan moving around in the room next door. I should have gone to talk to him. I didn't because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I wanted the answer to the question clawing at my brain. What if he really did do it? Barely slept. Maybe an hour. 2 at most. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the house. Back in the smoke. Back in the fire. I didn't even realize I had dozed off until I jolted awake to the sound of Uncle David yelling from the living room. I got up too fast, my head spinning. I grabbed a t-shirt from the pile of donated clothes the Red Cross had dropped off and threw it on as I stepped out into the hallway. Ryan was already there, standing stiff near the door, and so was Detective Calloway. My stomach dropped. "Uncle." David's face was red, his jaw clenched tight. "You already questioned them. You already took their clothes, their fingerprints. What else do you want?" Calloway didn't even blink. "We need to talk to Ryan again." My uncle swore under his breath. "Not without a damn lawyer." Calloway exhaled slowly, then turned to Ryan. "A friend of yours came forward." Ryan frowned. "What?" The detective reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "A statement from a girl named Jessica Liu." Ryan's face drained of color. I stiffened. Jessica. She was his... I didn't know. Something. Not quite a girlfriend, but definitely more than just a friend. She'd been at the house a few times, always sneaking, up to his room, always whispering in that way that made me feel like I was eavesdropping even when I wasn't. "What did she say?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Calloway watched him carefully. "She said you told her you hated your parents." Ryan's hands curled into fists. "She said you told her you wanted to get rid of them." I felt the air leave the room. Ryan's head snapped up. "That's bull..." "She said you bought gasoline the day before the fire." Silence. I felt like the floor had just cracked open beneath me. "She's lying," Ryan spat. Calloway didn't react. He just studied. Him, slow and careful. "Is she?" Ryan's breathing was uneven. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. And for the first time since this started, he didn't say, "I didn't do it." He just looked at me. And in that moment, I felt something crack deep inside me because I knew I finally knew. Ryan didn't say anything. He just stood there, his breath shallow, his hands twitching at his sides. His whole body was tense, like a rubber band stretched too tight, ready to snap. I wanted him to look at me. Really look at me. But he wouldn't. Calloway exhaled, slow and steady. "Ryan, let's not do this the hard way. We can talk at the station." "No," Uncle David interrupted, stepping between them. "You're not taking him anywhere without a lawyer." Ryan's jaw clenched. His whole body was practically vibrating. Calloway watched him for a moment longer, then turned to me. "Michael." I tensed. "What?" "We have evidence. Witnesses. People who say Ryan had a motive." He paused. "What do you think?" Hated him in that moment. Because I knew exactly what he was doing. He was giving me a choice. He was making me decide if I was going to lie for my brother or not. The worst part? I didn't know the answer. I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry. My whole body felt numb. Ryan finally looked at me. For the first time since the fire, he really looked at me, and I saw it. The fear, the guilt, the horrible, stomach-churning truth. My legs felt weak. "Ryan," I whispered. His eyes darted to Calloway, then back to me. He shook his head. Barely. Like he was begging me to stay quiet. Like he was pleading for me to save him. My throat tightened. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. He was my little brother. The same kid who used to cry when I beat him in video games, who used to steal my hoodies, who used to follow me around like I was some kind of hero. He was all I had left. But so were my parents. And they were dead. Because of him. I took a shaky breath. "I don't know," I finally said. Ryan flinched like I had hit him. Calloway exhaled and nodded like he expected that. He took a step toward Ryan. "We need you to come with us." Ryan's whole body tensed. His breath was coming out fast, uneven. "Mike." Uncle David stepped forward again, his voice sharp. "He's not saying another word without a lawyer." Ryan looked at me, his expression almost betrayed. But what was I supposed to do? Lie? Pretend I didn't know? I already knew. And maybe I had known for a while. Maybe I had seen the cracks, the warning signs, the way Ryan had changed over the past year. Maybe I had ignored it, convinced myself it was just normal teenage rebellion. But it wasn't. He had done it. And no matter how much I wanted to protect him, I couldn't change that. I couldn't bring our parents back. I couldn't take back the fire, the screams, the way their bodies had been carried out in bags. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I even knew my own brother anymore. Ryan was silent as the officers led him away. He didn't look at me again. 2 years later, Ryan took a plea deal. 25 years. I didn't go to the sentencing. I couldn't. I sat outside the courthouse instead, staring at the sky, wondering if our parents would have wanted this. I still don't know the answer. I don't talk to Ryan anymore. He tried writing a few times from prison, but I never responded. Because I didn't know what to say. Because I still dream about the fire, still hear my mother screaming, still wake up with the smell of smoke clinging to my skin. I still wonder if I could have stopped him. Maybe I should have. But it's too late for maybes. It's too late for anything. You don't know me, but I know you. You are here, drawn in by the same dark curiosity that lingers in all of us. That small voice inside that whispers, "What happened? Why did they do it? Could I have stopped it?" You came because you want to. Know the truth, and I will tell it to you. But be warned, once you hear this story, you won't be able to unhear it. It started with a phone call. A calm, quiet voice, almost emotionless. "I need an officer at my home," the woman said. I did something wrong. The 911 operator asked her to clarify. The woman didn't hesitate. "I killed my children." A pause, a moment of disbelief, the kind of silence that stretches, heavy and unnatural. The operator's voice tightened, asking, "Ma'am, what did you say?" But the woman didn't repeat herself. She simply gave her address. The officers arrived within minutes, sirens cutting through the humid Texas air. The house was quiet, the front door unlocked. Inside, everything was clean, orderly. The smell of bleach clung to the air, mixing with something else, something damp. Andrea Yates stood in the living room, her wet clothes clinging to her thin frame. Her dark hair dripped onto the beige carpet. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers slightly curled as if she had just let go of something. She didn't run, she didn't cry. She only looked at them with tired eyes. "They're in the bathtub," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The officers moved quickly, pushing past her, stepping into the hallway, following the scent of chlorine and something far worse. The bathroom door stood open. Water still filled the tub, murky and tinged with something darker. And there, beneath the still surface, were 5 small bodies. 5 children. The youngest, just 6 months old. The oldest, 7 years, floating, silent. One officer staggered back, covering his mouth. The other radioed for paramedics, though he knew it was pointless. It was far too late. Back in the living room, Andrea stood still, her damp clothes leaving, small puddles beneath her feet. She watched them with an expression that was impossible to read. Not blank exactly, not detached. Something else. Something worse. One of the officers asked her why. Why would she do this? Why would she take the lives of her own children? Andrea's gaze flickered just slightly. Her lips parted. And then, she said something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They were going to hell. She murmured. I had to save them. And that was when they knew. This wasn't just a murder scene. This was something else entirely. This was madness. They took her in without a fight. She didn't resist when they led her out of the house, her bare feet leaving damp prints on the tile, then onto the concrete steps, then into the back seat of the patrol car. Neighbors stood in their yards, arms folded, faces pale. Some whispered to each other, others just stared. The Yates family had lived on Beachcomber Lane for years, and people knew them. At least they thought they did. Andrea was quiet, always with the kids, always tired-looking but polite. Rusty, her husband, worked long hours at NASA, and the kids were always outside playing. A normal family, or so it seemed. But now 5 small bodies were being carried out of the house, one by one, wrapped in white sheets. A paramedic had to turn away, swallowing down bile. Another clenched his jaw so hard it clicked. No one spoke as they worked. What was there to say? Inside the police car, Andrea sat still, staring ahead. Water from her hair dripped down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe it away. The officer driving kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, but she didn't meet his eyes. He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to scream, to show something, remorse, horror, anything. But she just sat there, hands resting loosely in her lap. At the station, they led her into a small, windowless room with beige walls and a single metal table. The chair creaked as she sat down. A detective came in, setting a tape recorder on the table, pressing the red button. His name was Detective O'Rourke, and he had been on the force long enough to see terrible things, but nothing like this. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked. His voice was steady, professional. Andrea blinked slowly. "I drowned them," she said. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She said it like she was telling him what she had made for dinner. O'Rourke felt a strange pressure in his chest. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Why?" Andrea's lips pressed together for a moment. Then she looked up, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. "I was saving them." "Saving them from what?" She swallowed. "Satan." A pause. The clock on the wall ticked. The air in the room felt too thick, too warm. "I didn't want them to grow up bad," she continued. "I didn't want them to go to hell. I waited until Rusty left for work. I filled the bathtub. I started with Paul." O'Rourke felt his stomach turn. He knew the names: Paul, Luke, John, Mary, and little Noah, the Yates children. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to stay composed. "You started with Paul," he repeated, writing it down. "Then what?" "I held him under, until he stopped moving." The way she said it made the hairs on his arms rise, flat, emotionless. "Then I did Luke." O'Rourke wrote it down, one by one as she named them: John, Mary, Noah. She had placed them on the bed after, tucking them in as if they were only sleeping. But Noah, the baby, had still been in the water when her oldest 7-year-old Noah walked in and saw. "He ran," she said softly. "But I got him." O'Rourke exhaled slowly, setting his pen down. He had interviewed murderers before. Men who had killed in anger, in revenge, in greed. But this was something else. This was different. He studied her, trying to find something in her face. Guilt, regret, even sadness. But there was nothing. She believed what she was saying. She truly believed she had saved them. The air in the room felt colder. O'Rourke reached over and turned off the recorder. Outside, in the hallway, another detective stood waiting. "Well?" he asked. O'Rourke ran a hand down his face, exhaling. "She's insane," he muttered. The other detective nodded slowly. "Yeah, but the jury might not see it that way." They both glanced toward the interrogation room, where Andrea Yates sat alone, staring at the tabletop. Her wet hair clung to her face, and for the first time, she blinked rapidly as if waking from a deep sleep. And then so softly the officers almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I'm sorry." But no one could tell if she was sorry for what she had done, or sorry she hadn't done it sooner. The station was quiet that night, but not the usual kind of quiet. This was something different, something heavier. No one spoke above a murmur, and even the sound of the coffee machine dripping in the break room felt too loud. Everyone had seen things, murders, suicides, accidents, but this was something else. 5 children drowned one by the person who was supposed to protect them. It was the kind of case that got under your skin, made it hard to go home and look at your own kids without feeling something cold settle in your stomach. Detective O'Rourke sat in his office, the confession tape sitting untouched on his desk. He hadn't played it back yet. He wasn't sure if he wanted to. Instead, he just sat there staring at it. Andrea Yates's voice still echoing in his head. "I was saving them." The words stuck with him. He had been expecting something else. Maybe an outburst, maybe tears, maybe some kind of fight. But she had just sat there, hands in her lap, telling him the story as if she were explaining how to do a load of laundry. She had known exactly what she was doing. And yet, there was something in her face, something buried deep beneath the blankness. A flicker of something he couldn't quite place. It didn't matter, not really. She had confessed. The case was already on its way to being sealed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, when there was a knock at the door. It was the station's psychiatrist, Dr. Keller. She was a sharp woman, mid-50s, silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. She had worked cases like this before, assessing mental states, trying to help the court understand the minds behind the crimes. "She's psychotic," Keller said, taking a seat across from O'Rourke. He exhaled through his nose. "I figured. She has a long history. Severe postpartum depression, multiple hospitalizations, suicide attempts. It was all documented. They were told not to have more children. But they did," O'Rourke muttered. "She stopped taking her medication. She was convinced Satan was inside her house, inside her children." Keller folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. "She didn't kill them out of anger. She did it because she thought she was saving their souls." O'Rourke rubbed his jaw. "That's not going to fly with the jury." Keller studied him. "It might, if they believe she's insane. She knew what she was doing." O'Rourke said. "She waited until her husband left. She called the police herself. That shows awareness. She also spent years in and out of mental hospitals, convinced that cartoons were sending her messages from God." Keller's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You can be aware of what you're doing and still be completely detached from reality." O'Rourke sighed, leaning forward, pressing his fingers against his temples. "So what are you saying?" Keller hesitated. Then, "I'm saying this isn't just a murder case. It's a mental health failure. She asked for help, and no one listened, and now 5 children are dead." The words sat between them, heavy and unmoving. O'Rourke had seen plenty of killers. He knew what evil looked like. But Andrea Yates didn't look like the men he had arrested before. She looked like someone who had been drowning long before she ever filled that bathtub. He stood, grabbing the confession tape off his desk. "Doesn't change what happened," he said. "She's still going to trial?" Keller nodded, standing as well. "We'll see what happens." But even as she walked away, even as the station settled into an uneasy silence, O'Rourke couldn't shake the feeling that this case wasn't going to end the way anyone expected. And somewhere down the hall, in a cold holding cell, Andrea Yates sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. She had done what she thought she had to do, and she would never understand why no one else saw it the same way. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras clicking, pens scratching against notepads. The air was thick with something unspoken: anger, grief, curiosity. People wanted to see the woman who had done the unthinkable. They wanted to look into her face and find some kind of answer, something that would make sense of it all. Andrea Yates sat at the defense table wearing a loose-fitting beige suit. Her hair had been brushed but hung limp around her face. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingers twitching slightly. She looked small, almost frail, nothing like the monster people whispered about. Rusty Yates sat in the front row, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. He hadn't spoken much to reporters, only saying that he still loved his wife, that he believed she had been sick, that she wasn't the villain people wanted her to be. But there was something in his eyes, something broken. The prosecution painted a simple picture. Andrea Yates was a murderer. She had killed her 5 children one by one in cold blood. She had known what she was doing. She had waited for her husband to leave. She had called the police afterward. That showed awareness. That showed intent. They played the 911 call for the jury. The courtroom was silent as Andrea's calm voice filled the air. "I need an officer to come. I did something wrong." "What did you do?" "I killed my children." Someone in the audience let out a sharp breath, a muffled sob. Rusty closed his eyes. The prosecutor looked at the jury. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply stated what she had done. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not an act of insanity. This was premeditated murder. Then it was the defense's turn. Dr. Melissa Ferguson, a psychiatrist, took the stand. She had examined Andrea, read through years of medical records, listened to hours of interviews. She spoke calmly, methodically, laying out the facts. Andrea had suffered from severe postpartum psychosis. She had been hospitalized multiple times. Doctors had warned Rusty and Andrea not to have more children, that another pregnancy could worsen her condition. But they had ignored the warnings. She believed she was saving them, Dr. Ferguson said. She believed Satan was inside her children. In her mind, this was not murder. This was an act of salvation. The prosecution pushed back. But she knew it was wrong. She called 911. Dr. Ferguson nodded. Because she believed the police would understand. She thought they would see that she had done what had to be done. The courtroom felt colder. The jury looked at Andrea, searching, her face trying to see what the truth was. But she just sat there, hands folded, staring at the table. Then came the autopsy reports. Dr. Patricia Moore, the medical examiner, described each child's final moments in clinical, detached language. She explained how long it takes for a child to drown, how their small bodies fight, how water fills their lungs, how their limbs thrash before finally going still. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in the back row wiped her eyes. When they showed a photo of the children before their deaths, smiling, bright-eyed, full of life, someone let out a quiet sob. Rusty's face remained unreadable. Andrea Yates didn't react at all. Then came the moment that would change everything. Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist, took the stand. He was the state's star witness and expert on criminal insanity. He had testified in some of the country's most high-profile cases. He told the jury that Andrea Yates had been inspired by an episode of Law and Order, that she had seen a storyline about a woman who drowned her children and thought she could plead insanity, that she had planned this, knowing she could manipulate the system. It was a powerful moment. The jury took notes. The prosecution nodded, satisfied. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. Life in prison. Andrea Yates showed no emotion as the words were read. She only blinked, slow and heavy, as if the weight of the world was finally settling onto her shoulders. Rusty sat motionless, staring ahead, his knuckles white. Outside, reporters shouted into cameras. The world had its answer. Justice had been served. But then, months later, something happened. A defense lawyer combing through transcripts discovered something. There was no Law and Order episode about a mother drowning her children. Dr. Dietz had been wrong, and that one lie would unravel everything. The appeal didn't make headlines at first. The media had moved on. There were new crimes, new tragedies to dissect, new names to replace Andrea Yates's. But in a quiet courtroom away from the cameras and the front pages, the foundations of her conviction began to crack. It started with a simple question. What if the jury had been misled? The defense argued that Dr. Park Dietz's testimony had been critical in convicting Andrea Yates. His claim that she had seen a Law and Order episode about a mother drowning her children and using the insanity defense had weighed heavily on the jury's decision. The problem? The episode never existed. The court had no choice. The conviction was overturned. By then, Andrea had been in prison for years. She had lived in a world of cement walls and steel bars, a place where time moved differently. She spent her days in a quiet fog, speaking little, staring at nothing. Sometimes other inmates whispered about her, their voices tinged with something between disgust and fear. Even in prison, there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, and killing children was one of them. But Andrea barely seemed to notice. When they told her she was getting a new trial, she just blinked. When they moved her from the prison to a mental hospital to await the proceedings, she went without protest. This time, things were different. The prosecution still called her a murderer, but now there was doubt. Doctors took the stand one after another, describing years of psychosis, the warning signs, the missed opportunities to intervene, her hospitalizations, the suicide attempts, the fact that she had stopped taking her medication after her 5th pregnancy. The defense didn't argue that Andrea Yates hadn't killed her children. That much was undeniable. But they argued something else, something far more difficult to swallow, that she hadn't been in control of herself when she did it, that she had truly believed she was saving them, that she was insane. And this time, the jury believed it. The verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea Yates wouldn't walk free. She would never be free. But instead of spending the rest of her life in a prison cell, she was sent to Kerrville State Hospital, a high-security mental institution. There was no celebration, no cheers. Outside the courthouse, people argued, some saying justice had been done, others calling it a failure. Rusty Yates didn't say much. He had already lost everything. In the years that followed, Andrea faded from public memory. She remained in Kerrville, living in a quiet, structured world where time passed without much meaning. She rarely spoke to anyone outside of the hospital. Occasionally, she would receive letters from Rusty, but she never responded. She spent her days reading the Bible. Some days, she would sit by the window and stare outside for hours, watching the trees move in the wind. No one knew what she thought about in those moments. Maybe she was remembering the sound of water filling the tub. Maybe she was remembering the way her children had looked at her, their small hands grasping for something that wasn't there. Or maybe she wasn't remembering anything at all, because some things are too terrible to remember, and even worse to forget.